Okay, so Parshas Toldos. I'd like to pick up from where we left off in our previous discussions in the previous classes, in terms of at what point is it okay to do things which would generally be considered a sin. Somehow we have to justify in certain cases, and that's a big dilemma which we face all the time, where we allow or make leniency to do something which we're not supposed to do, and we say this is the type of circumstance where... So we've been dealing with the case, specifically with the case of lying, or not telling the truth, which isn't always the same thing. So we use that as an example when we were discussing different ways that you can deal with people who are bad people, different ways that you can arrange to get what it is that you need to get, especially if you feel that all you're trying to do is just gain equal ground with the people who are trying to take advantage of you.
Is there actually a mitzvah not to lie in the Torah?
So, that's a good question. I mean, people like to cite the verse, Midvar Sheker Tirchak, you should distance yourself from lies. But technically, that's referring to a case of in court where a person is not supposed to commit perjury. But the Torah doesn't say. The Torah also says lo sechachashu, you may not lie. But the Torah is referring to cases of money, generally speaking. Just saying a lie might not necessarily be its own biblical obligation, but it would be included within the obligation of having the following the ways of Hashem and things like that, which would it's hard to pinpoint it to that, but certainly v'alachta b'drachav, you shall walk in his ways, includes having all good midos. That is a positive commandment in the Torah, and therefore, in the same way, the Torah never tells us thou shalt not be arrogant. But we know that that's included within the expectation of midos that the Torah has from us. So this seemingly, in a simple understanding, that's where it would be included. You could make it a subcategory of the Torah's prohibitions to lie in court and things like that, but I don't know if that's necessary.
There's deception in the case of Tamar that's not seen for bad.
Right, so that's sort of where we're going with all this, in that direction, which is it seems from the reading of Sefer Bereshis, which is where we get our midos from, as we're saying, it seems like it's okay to adjust things in order to... The end does seem to justify the means. That's what we're learning. And this week's Parsha is one of the most striking examples of that, and that, if you want to look inside, we see on page 134, which is when Yitzchak becomes old, and his eyes cannot see as well. And he calls his son Esav and he says to him, I don't know how much time I have, even though it turns out Yitzchak had quite a bit of time, but he didn't know how much time he had. A simple calculation is made by the commentaries that a person should start to worry or take seriously the end of life and start to make arrangements, or should have arrangements done within 5 years of the age of the passing of one of the parents. So if someone's parents passed at 100, then at 95, they should make sure to have everything in order by then, give or take 5 years. So if you think about this, Yitzchak is 123 when he sends Esav out, and his mother lived to 127, so it was within that time that he's supposed to be making sure everything is in place for when he leaves. Of course, he would die 5 years after his father's age of death. His father, Avraham, lived to 175, and he would live to 180, so it turns out he had another more than 50 years left in his life. But at least at this point, he feels that's what he needs to do, and so he prepares for the giving of the blessing to Esav. Rivka feels otherwise. Rivka seems to believe that the blessing needs to go to Yaakov. And for some reason, which we're not having a discussion of this today. For some reason, she doesn't have this discussion with Yitzchak. She doesn't say to him, I heard you want to give Esav the blessing. I don't think. There seems to be some silent debate going on between Yitzchak and Rivka throughout the parsha.
He gave a very short answer. The Nebuah came to her, not to Yitzchak. It says, Vayomer Hashem law. So she must have figured it didn't come to him. It's only for her to know.
Right, no, we'll discuss the whole Nevuah concept soon, you're right, but that doesn't mean that in general we don't find them discussing this at all. The only discussions we have is when it comes to Shidduchim. That's the only time that Yitzchak and Rivka discuss their children, at least to us. I'm sure they talked all the time, but it seems that at least from what the Torah wants to teach us is that they were not on the same page in terms of the approach towards Yaakov and Esav. That's clear. The Torah makes it very clear. Rivka Oheves as Yaakov, and so okay. For whatever reason, that's the way it is. And so Rivka takes matters into her own hands, and she arranges for Yaakov to come in and take the brachas away from Esav. Now, we mentioned this a few weeks ago when we talked about the Akedah. We said that a real test is not when I get you to do something that you know you should do and that you are likely to do and that you've done in the past. Those are not tests. Yeah, I can have something which I've done in the past, but it's hard for me, and I'm asked to do it again, and it's still hard for me. It's a little bit of a test. But a test really challenges me to the core. It finds that place within me, where we say the Nekudas HaBechira, that point where I'm really struggling, and it's almost 50-50, or even more towards the other direction. And when I face that test, that's a real nisayon. That's a test. So many people think about other people and they say, what's wrong with this person that they stole the money in this case? I would never have done that, and so we tend to look down on people because of this. But we don't know what that person's particular struggles are. We don't know the situation and the difficulties that person's gone through. And what we need to do is think about the fact that every one of us has something similar. Everyone has something like this. Everyone's got something where everyone else, or at least we believe, if everyone else would look at us, they would say, I can't believe a person could do something so terrible. And it's strange that all of us have something like that, and yet all of us manage to judge everyone else for their things. It's a strange world we live in. Okay, but we said that by Avraham, his test is not going to be sent to a certain land and there's a famine there, not to complain to Hashem. Okay, that was one of the tests, but that's only the beginning of a test. To have his wife taken away, that's a test, but still not challenging Avraham to the deepest part of his soul. But to tell Avraham, take your son up to the mountain and bring him as an offering, that pushes Avraham past the point of what he should have been able to tolerate. And the passing of a test like that, that's really a sign of Avraham's devotion to Hashem. As we say, Ki ata yadati, now I know, Ki yirei Elokim ata, that you are truly God-fearing. So the commentaries explain that Avas Hashem, love of God, that came easy for Avraham. But Yiras Hashem, withholding, restricting, showing a severity, that was difficult for Avraham. And asking Avraham to do the ultimate severity, and he passed the test, and he was going to do it, so that's a real nisayon. What's Yitzchak's nisayon?
So does that mean a nisayon has to be out of Yira and not out of Abba?
No, as we'll see. Yitzchak's nisayon is the other way. For Yitzchak, reverence and fear comes easy. For him to be completely submissive to the instructions that his father gives him, and him not to demand the law, the explanation, the justice, the sense that a person of din would expect. For Avraham, Hashem tells him, go do something, he'll do it. That's easy. Because he has such love for Hashem, and love doesn't ask for explanations. But Yira needs explanations, needs reasons. What Yitzchak should have done is challenge Avram and say, where's the justification for this? How does this make sense? How does this jive with all your prophecies? Or who gives you a right to take someone's life without me knowing for sure that you are, in fact, instructed by Hashem? And instead, Yitzchak gives all that up and experiences Avas Hashem, and that's his test within the Akedah. And other places throughout the Torah, that's always going to be the test of Yitzchak, is to act with Ava, the opposite of the Yira.
It just seems to me that the test for Abraham was, that's the ultimate in love, to sacrifice your son for, that sounds like Ava. That it's the ultimate in Ava.
Well, it's
Because fear, I mean, if he was afraid, then it sounds like he wouldn't do it. You know, if there was Yira.
well, it's Yira towards Hashem. The question is what.
No, I understand, but if you had Yira, then
It's still an act. It's still an act of severity, and the act of severity, even done out of love, is still seen as severe. And so that's his ultimate test. Where's Yaakov's test? Where is Yaakov challenged? So
Ish
Going
Tam,
to
he
love
was
on?
supposed to be an Ish Tam, so engaging in this kind of thing was against his...
So Yaakov is sent out. Yaakov is emes. Titein emes the Yaakov. And Ish Tam, take the aleph and the tam, and you've got emes. Yaakov, it's simplicity. And we use the word tam by the Pesach Seder, and there it has a negative connotation. And here we use the word tam, and it means something so positive. And the reason is because tam means straightforward. Now, you can be straightforward because you are so simple-minded, or you can be straightforward because you're so complex-minded, if I could use that. Right, related to the word perfect. You would say that you can have very, very simple statements which are uttered by children, and almost similar types of simple statements uttered by monks who have contemplated the world for 50 years and come up with these very simple statements. And even though they're both one sentence, you can see the difference in brilliance between one which is from a child, and you can tell that the other one is very deep and contains within it some very years and years of contemplation. You can have simple statements out of complexity and simple statements out of simplicity. Yaakov is straightforward. Yaakov is the truth. Yaakov only knows the truth. And so what he has to do is bring up his truth on the altar and sacrifice it in the service of Hashem. And that's his nisayon, because his nature is truth. His nature is balance, his nature is harmony, and Hashem says, okay, but you know what? You're being truthful because you're inclined to truth. That's your nature. And as we discussed in previous classes, if you're doing something because you're inclined to do so, that's not service of Hashem. Furthermore, telling the truth isn't always the right thing to do. And so finding that balance of telling the truth in some places and lying in other places, that is the true truth. That is really telling the truth. So that's what we're going to try to figure out today. This parsha of Yaakov taking the blessings, which is very much related to the previous parsha of Yaakov taking the firstborn right from Esav. But let's begin with this parsha of Yaakov taking the blessings. So he says to his mother, I have a problem because my brother Esav is a hairy man, and what if my father feels me? What if he takes hold of me? And I will be in his eyes, kimisateya is the language, I will be in his eyes like a jester. I will be in his eyes, I will be a joke in my father's eyes. Which is interesting, because that's not what I would have expected from his father. I would expect his father to see him as a cheater, but that's not what Yaakov says. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to get cursed. To which Rivka says, no, your curse is on me. But besides that, I'm going to give you, here's what we're going to do. And so she puts the goat's skins on him and she sends him in. And Yaakov comes before his father. And he might be the world's worst liar. We'll see as we go through this. That's actually not the case. But the simple reading of the verses is that he comes in and says, Avi, father. And he says, Hineni, who are you, my son? And he says, Anochi Esav b'choracha. I am Esav, your firstborn. I have done as you have said to me. Now rise, please. And that please, of course, was a dead giveaway. And sit up and eat of what I have captured so that you shall bless my soul. So Yitzchak says to him, how'd you find so quickly? And Yaakov, seemingly does a terrible job, says, well, Hashem, your God, has arranged things for me. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem was not what Yitzchak was expecting to hear from Esau. So Yitzchak says, come close here. So doesn't that sound like had Yaakov done, let's assume this for now, had Yaakov done a better job, then there wouldn't have been this test of him feeling him, right?
I don't know. When he says it's the voice of Yaakov, I mean, you could have two brothers, and one has a slightly more raspy voice, let's say, than the other one. So I don't know, and also because Esau is noted for one positive thing, namely the respect of his father. I don't know that please is out of place. I mean, there are all of these. Aren't there the midrashim that say that he confused Yitzchak by asking him a sort of detailed block of questions and all this kind of stuff, so that it may be that by saying please that that really wasn't a detraction of acting like Esau.
Maybe, except we know the way Esau comes in, because he's going to come in a few verses from now and he's not going to say please. So we use the psukim coming up where he says the exact language Esau uses later is Yakum Avi, get up dad, that's it. There's no na over there. So it does seem from, he has a kumna and he has a yakum avi, so that please is there for Yaakov, but not there for Esav. So, but however it is, I mean, one of the commentaries goes so far as to say that actually what had happened was Yitzchak knew that there was a chance that Yaakov would try to steal it, and he knew that if Yaakov would try to steal it, he would try to talk like Esav, so therefore he instructed Esav to talk like Yaakov. And Yaakov ended up talking like Yaakov, which confused Yitzchak because it was talking like Yaakov, but it sounded like too much like Yaakov than Esav's fake talking like Yaakov. So we've got a whole Shakespearean situation going on there.
But
however,
in Hebrew, when you say Yakum Avi, that's actually a very respectful way to say things without saying please. Like in English, will you get up? Rather than get up, kum. If you wanted to just say kum, Avi, get up, father, then that's...
Yeah, it's not quite, and that's part of the proof that Esav was trying to be a little more, but wasn't good at it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
We also see when they were doing the negotiations for the birthright, he to his brother, he says, Hali Teni Na.
Oh, interesting. He does say it to his brother. Well, that's a good point. What?
He's starving to death. He's willing to put in please.
Right. Although one of the I remember one of the commentaries says that it says in Parshas Bo that you're supposed to eat the Korban Pesach roasted, right? But not al tochlu mimenu na, as the Torah uses the word na for meaning raw. So one of the commentary says, Halitani, no, give it to me raw before it's even cooked. It wasn't a please.
What about, is it Onkelos who translates na as now?
Yes.
Right, right.
So then, actually, that really complicates matters if he's right, because then it sounds like there's a certain urgency when he says, get up, get up
Well,
now.
it doesn't mean that
before.
It doesn't mean that Yaakov's no is now.
Yeah,
right.
I know.
Okay. But I imagine there is a sense of urgency in Yaakov here because he knows that any moment Esav is coming through that door.
Right.
Okay, so Yaakov is trying, at least this is the way it's simply read by anyone reading the Chumash. Yaakov is trying, but he's giving himself away, and somehow Yitzchak is fooled by the feeling of the hair, and he says, okay, you know what? So then Yitzchak says to him, Ata ze b'ni Esav? So, are you Esav? Vayomer ani. He says, I am. I am what? He doesn't finish the sentence. He says, I am. So he says, all right, enough of this. Just give me the food, and here's your blessing, and he gives him the blessing and sends him away. Esav comes in and says, get up, eat. So he says to him, who are you? And he says, Ani bincha b'chorcha Esav. Right? I am your son, your firstborn, I am Esav. He gives the whole Rachel bitcha ketana there. So Yitzchak trembled, a great trembling, etc. So what we have to understand is that this simple reading of the verses is not the way we should read it. Maybe that's the way we teach it at first, but Yaakov is capable of more. Yaakov can understand, psychologically speaking, what his father is going to hear when he uses certain words. And even Rashi explains, Anochi Esav b'chorecha means, when he said, I am Esav, your firstborn, so it can be read as two separate statements. Anochi, I am who I am, and Esav b'chorecha, Esav is your firstborn son. And that's why he didn't say, Ani Esav b'chorecha, because Ani means, I am Esav, your son. But Anochi is more of a self-identification, so it's as if it's a self-standing statement. Anochi, I am whoever I am. And Esav b'charecha, Esav is your firstborn son. And actually the nekudos, I should say the tam, underneath the words Anochi Esav b'charecha, do seem to put a little bit of a space between Anochi and Esav b'charecha, as if they're somehow, I am who I am, and Esav is your firstborn son.
Okay, we know that Yaakov wrote the contract, and Esau signed it, and Yaakov went to get a dean, to make it a formal contract. You're going to tell me that Esau didn't know that Esau sold his the birthright?
It seems that he doesn't. It seems certainly according to most midrashim, Yitzchak is not aware of this.
Why wouldn't he tell Yitzchak before?
Why wouldn't who tell?
Why wouldn't Yaakov tell Yitzchak?
I imagine that would run into the same question for why Rivka doesn't really reveal her opinion on the children before. It sounds like everyone's got their ideas and everyone knows why everyone else feels the way that they feel, and there's no need to have a discussion because everyone just knows what everyone's thinking, meaning in their approach. But not that, one of the commentaries says that Rivka didn't feel it was her job to snitch on Esav. If Yitzchak wants to see only good things in Esav, then she has no right to ruin that image of Esav. Something like that. So in which case Yaakov wouldn't either. This is not something necessarily to reveal. And it could be in the house of Yitzchak. There was this severity in judgment and closedness to a certain extent where matters which involve you and God are not necessarily discussed in open discussion.
But if Yitzchak is the one who is so tied to Din, if there has been a contract, and he's talking about then it would seem like he would be exactly the right person to tell about it.
Well, actually, you'll notice this because Vayechrad Yitzchak charada gedola. Yitzchak trembles a terrible trembling, and when he hears that he gave the blessing to the wrong son, and Esav says, now it makes sense why you called him Yaakov. Vayakveni zepamayim. It's the second time he tricked me. To which Yitzchak says, "What do you mean the second time?" He says, I'm sorry, you read the exact words. As Bechorasi lakach, he took my firstborn right, V'hine ata lakach birchasi, and now he has taken my blessing. To which Yitzchak says to him, well, I'm sorry, he's got all the blessings now. What can I do for you? And the commentaries explain, he says to them, oh, you sold him the firstborn right. I just dodged the bullet. Had I given this blessing to you, that would have messed things up. So yeah, Yitzchak was supposed to bless Yaakov because of that exchange, but he didn't know that, and now he realizes that everything fell into place. But why should Yaakov have told him? Maybe it's not Yaakov's job to tell him.
Is it allowed to sell your birthright? I mean, is that something that's allowed?
That's a whole big discussion in terms of the selling of the birthright. It seems that before the Torah was given and within certain areas that would be okay to do.
But not nowadays.
Certainly not.
Like if a brother said,
Right. I mean, it doesn't work with regular brothers. At best, even before the giving of the Torah, it only works with twins.
Part of the difference between Yaakov's earlier and later life is in his earlier stage like this, there's avoidance of confrontation. He's not going to go and say, hey, Dad, who he doesn't get along with to begin with, let me tell you what the problems and resolutions and things are.
Right.
And whereas later on, he's got to confront the angel, he's got to confront Esav, as opposed to...
Right. And he's learning from his mother, and Rivka says this is the way we're doing it, so he listens to Rivka. Yeah, we can have this discussion. It's a separate discussion in terms of the approaches of Yitzchak versus Rivka in relationship to Yaakov and Esav. But I want to point out that whose side is Hashem on? So you could say, well, clearly Hashem is on Yaakov's side because Yaakov gets the brachos. But there's actually something more. If you remember, at the beginning of the parsha, it says, this is how the parsha begins, Vayihi ki zaken Yitzchak, and it was when Yitzchak got old, Vatechena einav meros, and his eyes became blind from being able to see. And Rashi cites 3 explanations for why he becomes blind. Explanation number 1, Rashi says, because Esav's wives were burning incense for Avodah Zarah, and even if it wasn't within his direct space, but somehow that he was so sensitive to that kind of thing that it made him blind. Explanation number 2, when he was at the Akedah, the angel's tears fell into his eyes, and later on that would blind him. And explanation number 3, Davar Acher, Rashi quotes this, Kidei sheyitol Yaakov es habrachos, so that Yaakov would take the blessings. Hashem blinds Yitzchak because Hashem knows that based on the choices that Yitzchak has made, the only way that Yaakov can get the brachos is by Yitzchak becoming blind. There's a bit of an irony here that Esav fools his father. And I should say this, Yitzchak allows himself to be blinded by Esav. And because Yitzchak allows himself to be blinded by Esav, the only way that Yaakov will be able to get the blessings is for Yitzchak to be blind so that Yaakov could then blind Yitzchak.
I don't understand how it could work if it was how the bracha could work if it was under false pretenses. Wouldn't that undo the whole... It sounds like
it still works. The blessings were given to whom the blessings were given. These are the blessings that we say that were passed on from previous generations, and whoever Yitzchak gives it to, it's the person that he's focused on, even if he thinks it's the wrong person. Which, all of this is unbelievably ironic and clearly arranged, because you may all be familiar with the medrash that says that in the upcoming parsha, where Leah, Yaakov wakes up in the morning and it's Leah, and he says to her, how could you be so dishonest? I get your father is a scoundrel, he's a thief, he's a trickster, but how could you? You're such a good person. And she says, I learned it from you. This is exactly what you did to your father. So, as we said, Esav blinds Yitzchak, so Hashem blinds Yitzchak, so that Yaakov can blind Yitzchak, so that Leah can blind Yaakov.
Out of line.
However, I should point out, the Yaakov has to do this. This is not a choice that Yaakov has. And Rabbi Koh mentioned before that you might even run into problems of listening to a prophet. As we know, the halacha says as follows. I'm going to read the Rambam inside. V'chein, im yomer lanu anavi, if a prophet will tell you, shenoda lanu shehu navi, now we have to know he's a prophet. Lavor al achas mikol mitzvos ha'amuros b'Torah, to transgress one of the commandments of the Torah. Or al mitzvahs harve, or even a number of mitzvahs. Bein kalos, bein chamuros, whether it be light or serious or light. Lefi shah, if it's a momentary thing, meaning if it's a time thing, if it's only for a certain amount of time. Mitzvah lishmoa lo, we are obligated to listen to him. If a prophet comes along and says there is no longer Shabbos, or there's no longer Bris Milah, or even if he says Shabbos moves to Sunday, or if he would say that the mezuzah should go on the left side of the door, we put him to death. Because a prophet that tries to make changes to the laws of the Torah is a false prophet, and false prophets are put to death. However, if a prophet comes along and says that we should, the mitzvah is the mitzvah, but in this particular case, one should do as follows. It is one of the 613 commandments that we do whatever it is that the prophet tells us to do. An example would be where Eliyahu transgresses one of the 613 commandments, which is that we are not allowed to bring a sacrifice outside of the temple. And yet he brings a sacrifice on Mount Carmel. And the reason is because he had a prophecy to do so. And had he said that from now on we only bring on Mount Carmel, we would have put Eliyahu Hanavi to death. But because he said that it's a one-time thing, therefore you should do it. Which means that Rivka, when she instructs Yaakov, based on her Ruach HaKodesh, that this is what Yaakov needs to do, Yaakov is bound by Torah law to follow the instructions of his mother and lie through his teeth to his father. That's what Rivka instructed him to do. Now, where that prophecy is, so you had mentioned that it was at the beginning where she goes to shame to say, why are these babies acting this way? And he says to her, V'rav Yavod Tzair, that the younger one should be on top. So therefore, this was a prophecy, and that's why you said she doesn't share it with Yitzchak, because it was a private prophecy, and a prophet can't repeat things unless he was told to repeat it, he or she was told to repeat it. It's interesting, because Rivka is actually not counted amongst the 7 prophetesses.
But it really wasn't a prophecy if she went to Shem Be'ever,
Right.
and he told her that's.
Well, he's not counted as one of the prophets either. But
I mean, it still doesn't mean she is at all, because if
right.
he just
But
told
that's
her-
the words that the commentaries use. They use the word prophecy. I actually, it works better, just at least at this point, works better with the commentaries who use a different word. They use Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh is somewhat easier to work with. Yep. The problem is that if you learn that Yaakov is following a direct prophecy passed on through his mother, then you no longer have, it's no longer really a test. Meaning he's not being asked to lie, he's being instructed by prophecy to lie. That doesn't seem like the biggest test. That's what it's in other words, you don't have to feel bad if Hashem tells Eliyahu to bring a sacrifice on Har Carmel. He's not doing a sin, he's doing the right thing. Those are Hashem's instructions.
Well, Abraham was also told.
Right.
No, so It's equivalent.
Right, but it's not quite the same as the way it's usually portrayed, which is that he's just... So I want to get to the point, but I want to just quote quickly the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra says that, the Ibn Ezra cites a number of places throughout Tanakh where the most righteous people in the world told a lie. He goes through, Ibn Ezra knew his Tanakh, so he says, we see David HaMelech lied, Elisha lies, Michiyahu lies, Daniel lies, Avram lies when he says, she's my sister, and I didn't mean sister, I meant my brother's daughter, which is like a sister, and all the... So he says that lying is, if there's a need to lie, you're allowed to lie. And so he dismisses the whole question, the whole issue that people are bothered by the lies. He says lying is okay when it's necessary to lie. If
Where is that?
on the pasuk Anochi Esav B'charecha. However,
Yeah, Yitzchak also lies about his wife.
right,
My sister.
right,
And that's more of a lie, I think, than I
right. But although, so it seems like all of this, right? Because at least Avram had the, well, she's my niece, right? So Rabbi Yerucham explains this, and this is really deep. Rabbi Yerucham says that the challenge isn't for Yaakov to try to trick his father. The challenge is for Yaakov to have such a perfect balance and composition and understanding of the situation that he needs to only lie exactly the amount necessary for lying and not a bit more. That's the challenge. Because if you have a license to lie, and so you can just say whatever you want, that's easy. You just walk in there and start telling stories. But knowing that it's not that he was instructed to lie, he was instructed to do whatever it takes to get those blessings. And it was his challenge to figure out those lines for how much he needs to say. And so Yaakov thought about it. And Yaakov says, the least amount of lying that I'm going to do is going to run into one problem, which is that my father is going to ask to touch me. Yaakov was so brilliant in this case that he knew exactly the type of weak lies that he was going to say that he could get away with as long as he has some backup for when his father touches him. So he says to his mother, okay, I've got a plan. This is what I'm going to do. He's going to ask me, what's your name? And I'm going to say, Anochi Esav B'charecha. And Anochi is going to be kind of like Anochi and Esav B'charecha. He's got all that worked out because that's the least amount of lie he has to say, because technically you could read into it. But he couldn't just walk in and say, Ani Esav. He wasn't allowed to do that. And so he says to his mother, based on my calculations, these perfect calculations, because he got it right to the T, because that's exactly what happens. His father says to him, maybe let me just feel you. And he feels him and says, okay, Yadayim Yidei Esav. And so Yaakov gets away with it. It was all because Yaakov calculated perfectly the least amount of lies that he would have to tell. And this is part of what we have to try to connect to and try to do ourselves, is whenever it is necessary to make concessions, that doesn't mean you get an open season on doing whatever it is that you need to do.
But isn't putting on the skins of the animals on him and wearing Esav's clothes, isn't that deception? Or
Yeah, it's all deception. It's all deception. But that's less of a deception. In other words, Yaakov says like this, I can walk in and say, Ani Esav. And then the father will never question it and he'll walk out. But that kind of lie is like a super lie. That can't even be read or reread or reinterpreted. So I can do those kinds of lies and just get away with it, or I can allow my father to fool himself and do all these sort of reinterpretable lies, probably not a real word, and do that. But this is what it's going to require, and so Yaakov has to figure all that out.
But it still seems like that's a lie too.
It is a lie, but it's not the same level of lie. That's what he's trying to avoid, the real lie.
Is it a matter of speaking? Is it the speaking of the lie versus acting?
Well, it's the,
deception?
again, an act can also be reinterpreted. It's harder to reinterpret words as they are, which would mean, again, this would be almost halacha l'maisa. If someone were to ask you in a certain situation whether or not you committed a certain act, and let's say it's the type of situation where you're allowed to lie, and you're able to say, it wasn't me. So you wouldn't be able to say just no. Did you break this dish? Now, assuming that if you're the one who broke this dish, that the world is about to fall apart. So let's say that that's going to happen. So now, you can't say no, because no is a direct lie. So you would have to find a way to say no without saying no, but not saying it no enough that the person says, well, that didn't exactly sound like a no. So figuring that out, that's our challenge. Saying something like, I don't know.
I
Well,
didn't
instead of
inhale.
saying no, what makes you think I would do that?
Right, or, right. I'm a little bit more careful with things in general for someone to ask me that question. Right. Turn the question back on the other. Right. Okay. Okay, but I'd like to have just a little bit of time. So I want to share with you something very, very deep from the Netziv. Rivka says to him, bring me, kachli misham, go to the sheep, and bring me shnei gedoye izim, 2 kids. And we're told that the 2 kids were, one was for the Korban Pesach, and one was for the additional meat, all these different interpretations. However, the Medrash says that what was the only time when the Jewish people brought 2 kids? It was Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, there were 2 goats that were brought. One of them, there was a little lottery that was made. One of them would be La Hashem, and the other one would be La Azazel. So says the Medrash that you should bring these 2 goats so that they could be a Yom Kippur offering. One should be La Hashem, and one should be La Azazel. So asks the Netziv, what is the meaning behind this Medrash? What's the message that Rivka is trying to bring Yom Kippur into this story? So listen to these words of the Netziv. The yesh ladas, because you should know. The chol mida ra sheba'olam, every bad attribute in the world, hema bechlala yitzira shebara Hashem gam osam, were also created by Hashem. Kedichsiv, as it says, yotzer or, ubare choshech. Ose shalom, most people can't finish this verse, ubore ra. In our morning davening, we change it from ubore ra to ubore esakol, but Hashem created evil. V'al karchach yesh behem eze tov, it's because they're not really evil, they have in them good. It's like poison, which sometimes we need poison in order to heal someone. So if that poison is being used to heal people, then why do we call it poison? Because most of the time it kills. And even when you do use it, if something is poisonous, if something is toxic, so then even when you do use it, you have to be very careful in the way you measure it out. So we call it poison, we treat it as being a bad thing, in order to remind us that this is not something which we're supposed to be using, but we're only using it in this situation. When you inject someone with, I don't know, what would be a real poison which we use for medicine?
Botox.
Botox? Is that poison?
Botulism.
Botulism?
Botulism, so Botox.
Right. Yes. So when you inject that into the person, if you treat it as if it's a positive thing, then people would some people do, but then people wouldn't be careful with it. We have to call it poison so that we're careful. He says every bad midah is poison. But there are times when you need that poison in order to survive a certain situation, in order to recover from a certain illness. He says the time had come for Yaakov to inject a little bit of falsity and trickery. And this is what we call, these are the words in the Netziv, this is what we call an avera lishma, doing a sin for a good purpose, which is as great as the mitzvah itself. It says this concept is represented by the 2 goats. The one goat, we do exactly what we're supposed to do with it. We do that all the time. We bring it up for Hashem on the altar with the Kohen Gadol and all the steps and procedures that are necessary. Then the other one is what is usually throughout the whole Torah considered a terrible transgression. We take it out to the mountains, far away, to some mountain which was actually demon worship, the Azazel. Even today, that word in modern Hebrew means hell. So it's a place, and the Torah tells us to throw, because Hashem says, the reason why you don't worship idols is not because it's a bad thing to worship idols. It's because I said so. And if I tell you, that's not worshiping idols, but if I tell you I want to be worshipped by you doing the following act, then that's what you're supposed to do. And if I instruct you to lie in this case, then that would be lying. That would be at the time that you're supposed to lie. So Yaakov needed that inspiration, that motivation. So she says to him, come, let's take the Sayer Lashem, and what you're going to do is the Sayer Lazazel. However, we know, the Medrash tells us, that because Yaakov causes Esav, the language the Torah uses when Esav comes in and he realizes that he's lost his blessings, Vayitzak tza'aka gedola umara, and he cried a terrible, bitter cry, ad ma'od. He cried a serious cry. Where else do we find those words, Tza'aka Gedola Umara? In the Megillah. When Esav's great-grandson, the grandson of Amalek, Haman, makes that terrible decree, and Mordechai is Vayizak Tza'aka Gedola Umara, those same exact words. Says the Medrash that because he made Esav cry this way, so the Jewish people deserve to cry this way too. And this is, by the way, as an aside, we have to be very careful when even our enemies, even when we bring punishment to our enemies, even when we're doing the right thing to do, there's still a power in their cries. They are human beings, and if they cry to God, God listens, regardless of the situation. It's just something that we generally have to think about. But the Netziv says that apparently Yaakov didn't do this perfectly. The lie that he does, this Sayer Lazazel, there was somewhere in there, I don't know if we can find it, somewhere in there's an area that Yaakov missed something, and that allows, in other words, the Netziv says, had Yaakov done it completely in the right way, then there would be no place for any retribution. If you're doing the right thing, there can't be a negative consequence. However, this thing is so sensitive, it's so difficult to be exact on all this, that wherever it is that Yaakov fails, that allows Esav to have his vengeance, at least in a threat, because actually not a single Jew dies from that terrible and bitter cry. But the threat of it, the at least the fear, the scaring of the Jewish people was a punishment as a result of that. And the Medrash says that Esav dropped 2 tears, one from each eye, and then there was a third tear that was going to drop, and an angel came and caught it, because that would have been too much. That Medrash is trying to say is that in the end, we have to be very careful, whatever we do, we have to be careful with whom we cause pain to.
So Yaakov was supposed to take the other goat and drop it off a cliff.
No, he was preparing these 2 goats. The remez, the hint to this was to the 2 goats of Yom Kippur. And she was saying to him, your actions are going to be more like the Sayer Lazazel than they're going to be the Sayer Lashem.
Because it sort of struck me, what does he need 2 goats for?
Right.
To prepare one meal?
Right.
I mean, like, what do you need so much?
Right, well, that's exactly it. I mean, according to this, it's all about the message she's trying to send him through the prophecy, or whatever it is.
You might need them because they might need, it means you all the things in one zone to cover them up.
Yeah, but she didn't know about the covering up until until after that discussion. She first sends him to do that. Then when he says, "But what's going to happen with if he asks me?" Then she says, "Well, we've got these goat skins." I just want to finish with one final point. Chaim Kanievsky, in one of his books, cites the story of Rav. Rav and his wife had a very interesting relationship. Basically, if he would say to her, "Make me soup," so she would make the chicken. And if he said to her, "Make chicken," so she would make soup. The Gemara has a different example with beans and whatever, but let's just work with that. So when Rabbi Chia, the son of Rav, realized this, so his father sent him in and says, "Go to your mother, ask her to make a soup." So he went into his mother and said, "Father wants chicken." So she said, "Chicken? I'll show him." And she made a soup. And for the first time in his life, Rav got a soup like he asked for. So he says to him, "What happened?" So he says, "Well, you asked for a soup, so I told her chicken." So he says, "Hainu de ka'amri inchi." This is what people say. The nafak minach taima melafach. Sometimes your children can be smarter than you. But don't do this, because the verse says, those who teach their tongues to speak falsity, they're basically, you're training yourself to speak lies. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky asks, he says, "I don't understand. The way you read the Gemara, it sounds like that this was something that Rav had never thought of." The way he says, "Wow, I can't believe my son is smarter than me." And he's saying it seriously. He's like, "Wow, I guess that would work if I would say it the other way." So the Chaim Kanievsky says, "I don't understand. I think anyone could have thought of it. I mean, even if you don't do it, anyone could have thought of this." And he says, clearly what we see from here is that Rav had thought of it, but couldn't bring himself to, even though he knew that his wife was doing the opposite of what he had asked for, he could not bring himself to talk to his wife differently than the way he felt. So he would say to his wife exactly what he wanted, because the other option would be deceiving his wife. And he couldn't bring himself to do that. So what his son taught him was, basically when his son did this, and he saw that he got soup, he saw that his wife hadn't been deceived, because she had done exactly what she wanted to do, which was to give the opposite of what she was told. So she was satisfied because she got him, and he's satisfied because he got the soup. So it couldn't have worked with him, because he would have had to, I mean, he could have done it too, but he didn't want to deceive his wife. But in this way, he's not deceiving his wife. She got what she wants, which is to show her husband that he's not going to get what he wants. And he got what he wants because he's got soup.
So he should make all of his requests through his son.
The problem is, he can't have, that's why he says, that would be good, but you can't train my son to speak lies. So that's why he says, we don't do it. I'd rather you not lie and I not have soup. So Chaim Kanievsky says, amazing that how carefully these people thought about it. I mean, you would think that would be the way husband and wife. If I want what I want, so I'm going to claim that store is too far away, or that these little lies we might say just in order to make our life more convenient. And it seems that those little lies are not okay. I mean, it could be that from the way you could read the Gemara as if somehow that might have been something you should have done. But at least, we have to be careful with our speech, with our words. I'd like to move on to somewhat of a different topic, Mr. Shem, next week. But to close off this idea, there are times when we do need to lie. There are times when we have to do things differently the way we're supposed to do. But that doesn't mean that the gates are open, doesn't mean the doors are open. We have to measure everything carefully and try to maintain the perfect balance. Thank you.